this one is kind of at the heart of things. So Tim, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. So as Dom said, delivering video at scale, actually talking to people who work for the major CDNs. I've got Neil Glazebrook from Limelight. Neil, if you'll say hello here real quick, tell us a little bit about Limelight and then also your time in the industry.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tim. So hi, everyone. Neil Glazebrook. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. Obviously, shame we couldn't be there in person in Boston, given that it's right on my doorstep. But certainly very happy to be on this Zoom call. I've been at Limelight for just over 2.5 years, and I'm responsible for the content delivery aspects of the product organization here at Limelight. And prior to that, I'd had a couple of stints at Akamai Technologies, working with my good friend over there, Peter. And so, yeah, I've been in and around content delivery and more specifically video over CDNs for probably close to a decade.
Very good. And speaking of Peter, Peter, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us about your company.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much, Tim. Good to see you, Neil. And I also am missing the in-person event. I know we're all getting used to these Zooms, but I really don't think it's going to replace the the ability to just hang out and catch up on what's going on around the place. So
nothing to do with
no, absolutely nothing. But if you happen to offer me one, I wouldn't say no. So I've been at Akamai just over 4 years now. Prior to that, I've got about 20 years experience across broadcast generally. So I've come to streaming kind of as content has moved from traditional broadcast onto streaming. As Tim introduced, I do work at Akamai Technologies. We are the largest global CDN. And just wanted to make a quick mention on your greening streaming initiative there, Tim and Dom. I think that's a fantastic idea. And that's something that actually Akamai has been very focused on for a long time. So since I joined the company just over 4 years ago, we've almost quadrupled our capacity. But in that time, our power consumption only went up 9%. And the Herculean amount of engineering that goes into trying to make that happen is not to be underestimated. And on the second side there, we have a commitment to be 50% of all our power comes from renewable by the end of the year. We're already there in Europe. Several of our data centers in the US are already 100% renewable. So I think this is a really fantastic initiative, and I'm keen to support you guys in this because I think this is
very much appreciate that. And I talked to Will Law and a couple of other guys from Akamai, and as you say, that part of the beauty is if we could stagnate the power consumption as we grow the capacity, that would certainly be.
Yeah.
I also think half the people on this conference are leaning forward to figure out what you have behind you there on the desk. I'm looking at the Star Wars poster trying to figure out which one that is. But anyway.
We can get that afterwards.
All right, Jim Hall, please introduce yourself.
Jim Hall, Senior Sales Engineer for EMEA for Fastly. I've been with Fastly now for 3 years. Before joining Fastly, I was at IGN, where I was the VP of Technology. Big part of my job there was looking after IGN's substantial video. I've been in the video streaming space for a very long time. Actually was a beta tester of real video back in the late 90s. So this is the first time actually that I've been on this side of the table. I've always been on the technology executive side of the table until I joined Fast.
Well, welcome. And what's fascinating, I'm writing an article this month on algorithms of player performance. And of course I went to Yuri Resnick, who was one of the guys who'd written some of the early real codecs. So yeah. It's a lot of fun. So I'm going to start with you, Jim, with a question. Because you all had done the Platinum sponsorship and because Chris had talked a little bit about this, he mentioned some of the things about CDN video at scale. Two pieces sort of came to mind for me, edge computing and Quick. Talk to me first of all about the impact of Quick, and then secondly, where does edge computing come into this? Because I know that's one of the big pushes from Fastly's standpoint.
So Fastly's been an active part of the quick standardization process. And we believe that where we're likely to see the most improvement with Quick so far from the testing is particularly mobile networks, and those mobile networks in developing countries. There will be some positive impact on more regular connections and whatnot, but the most notable impact will be on mobile, especially in developing countries.
Okay, interesting. Neil, edge computing is also something that Limelight is pushing heavily into. What's your take, sort of, on edge computing for video at scale, as well as something like Quick?
Yeah, I think we're sort of we're pushing edge compute more really as an augmentation to content delivery. And we recognize, customers can customize video workflows either, at the sort of the origin end, doing it in a data center, and that's possible. You can do some really funky stuff there, or the other extreme is that you can do things on a per platform basis, whether it's Android, iOS, or whatever the end platform is, and that gets really gnarly because of the number of permutations. So we're finding a number of our customers, the content providers, are really looking at the CDN to really give them a platform where they can start to customize some of those behaviors on a certainly on a per platform customer platform basis, and in some instances customize the workflow on an end user by end user basis, whether that's manifest manipulation or something along those lines. So we, rather than just try and say we are going to be the ubiquitous CDN, edge compute one-stop shop for no matter what your use case is, we're really trying to stay very close to the video workflows, whether it's live or on demand. So that's where we've put our energy.
Interesting. Peter, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I mean, edge compute is and is kind of an emerging topic now. What's interesting about Akamai's network is it always was an edge network. So we've always been very deep on net at the last mile. And so what we've had in our, we've had functionality at the edge that you could call edge compute, but we never really labeled that. We've had back at, we have the thing called advanced metadata, which is this massive script engineering capability where you can put an awful lot of custom functionality into that, which will then execute literally on that first hop. So in those first few milliseconds from the device leaving to getting, we can then make a lot of, real-time decisions about which manifest we're going to serve. We can do it. And this has been really important in these kind of network challenging times to try and filter out requests as early as possible. So we're not pushing pressure back up onto the peering network. So now we've evolved that to a feature we call Edge Workers, which is a generic JavaScript engine. So you can put little bits of JavaScript right out of the edge. So if you don't want to have to learn our language, you can write just generic JavaScript. But then there's we're looking further back up the stack. Do we deploy things like generic Kubernetes containers? And where does that functionality sit down the stack, especially as you have 5G networks opening up and there's suddenly huge capacity that we're going to have at the edge. So the edge moves further out at this point. So as a developer writing software, especially if you're writing it for media or for IoT or for security, where you put bits of functionality, it's suddenly not, well, I'm going to do everything here in the data center and then a little bit here. It's now I have this kind of almost continuum of compute of how I'm aggregating information or making decisions, that where I place things, it requires a very different mindset to some of the things we've seen today. So it's great that we're just scratching the surface on some of these new applications.
So I'm going to stay with you, Peter, for a second. You mentioned obviously the challenging times we're in. Everybody sort of came into 2020 running a marathon, doing well in the marathon of video delivery, and suddenly we're asked to do a 2-kilometer sprint right in the middle of it. What's the impact then on the CDN business?
Yeah, so if you actually look at the traffic, it was from about end of February into mid-March, and then from really mid-March is when it kicked in. It was basically as countries started going into lockdowns, and we started saying we literally saw in 1 month period a whole year's worth of growth, which was The good news from the CDN side, and I'm sure this is true of both Jim and Neil, is that even number years are usually big years just because there's so many sports events. So we were gearing up for Olympics, we were gearing up for UEFA, we're gearing up for all of these big events we thought were going to happen in 2020 that didn't actually happen. So there was actually a lot of build out of capacity, which, it wasn't like we suddenly hit a wall. It's like we just consumed a lot of the capacity we had planned for later in the year sooner than we had anticipated. So in that respect, the networks held up very well.
Nice. So Neil, I know when your CEO did the earnings report a couple of weeks ago, he talked about sort of the thing that Peter talked about here, where we're gearing up for a bunch of live events, and suddenly those live events are being pushed to 2021, but that there seemed to be, because of work from home, because of some things even like Zoom, that there seemed to be an uptick of capacity use. Are we running the risk of running out of capacity, or are we just sort of testing the market, testing the models to see how they do?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think similar to Peter's comment, we'd actually planned very aggressive expansion build-outs for the first half of 2020. So that was already, that was planned back last year. So no changes to that. I will say that, some of the expansion plans, both in terms of, with the sort of two dimensions, there's increased capacity. And then there's, of course, always we're looking for new locations and new peering relationships. So certainly we have tried to bring those as far forward in 2020 as we can. What I think we have seen is some regional hotspots, and we have found, in certain regions, and I'm thinking, India is a great example. Literally, as we deploy additional capacity, those servers are just pegged, right? They're just full. And we wouldn't normally expect that, right? We'd see a more gentle ramp. We want to get capacity in, and then the consumption patterns follow that. So that's really, I think, one area is just, we almost like the build it, they will come. And we have, maybe it's not irrational, but we do have, content providers come to us and say, well, how much capacity can you give us? We'll take it all. Right? What sort of guarantees can you give us? And we're not there are a few customers that have asked those sorts of questions in the past, but we're seeing it from customers that we wouldn't normally expect it from, those that are actually more regional and smaller in nature.
Interesting. And it's fascinating when you mentioned that about India. I worked there quite a bit. The fact that there aren't even cricket matches to be watched at this point, and that capacity is still being pegged. So, Jim, from Fastly's standpoint, obviously you all IPO'd not too long ago and continue to grow. What has the growth caught you flat-footed, or has the growth been something that you were just chomping at the bit waiting for?
So in terms of planning, because we are the new kid on the block, we are always growing. But also we've been planning for the same events that Peter mentioned. We've built out our network pretty substantially in the last 18 months already, so it didn't catch us out. There's also, there's been a trade-off as well, because while we see an uptick in certain customers, we also see a substantial down in others as well. Now, we do a lot of streaming. And so overall, it went steeply up and to the right. So, but in terms of capacity, we were fine. We saw some really substantial increases from certain countries. Italy doubled. United Kingdom was over 75% increase. So, it was good in terms of it filled our pipes very nicely, but it didn't hurt us in any way.
Okay, good.
I do want to say, though, that there was still some very busy people ensuring that things were routed correctly to ensure that we were leveraging all the right peering and transit relationships so that that was as seamless as it was for the people that needed it.
And it does seem to be that our industry is quite a bit busier than the average industry out there, regardless of whether we're essential or not. So just a quick question for all of you, and then I'm going to come back, Jim, to another question for you. But okay, we've seen these spikes. We return to a norm. Well, two questions. Do we return to a normal sometime in the next 6 months before the end of the year? And also the pent-up demand for those live events which have been postponed, does that add additional capacity issues that we're going to have to face, say, end of the year moving into 2021? And I'll throw that open to all three of you.
I'll jump in if I may, guys. Yes, it's interesting. We saw announcements, I think Thursday or Friday last week, that EPL is going to reconvene on June 17th. There's already Bundesliga activities. So it's going to be interesting to see as those events are going to be streaming first, rather than live crowds and stadiums first. It's going to be interesting to see what sorts of volumes we'll see from them, and B, what technology changes we'll see from the providers to try and compensate for that sort of lack of the stadium experience. So I think we are going to start seeing that. Well, we're literally on the cusp of it. We're a few weeks away, so I don't think we're going to have to wait very long, Tim, to figure out what this new norm is going to be around, what it's going to be like.
Very good point. Peter, Jim?
Yeah, I'll jump in there.
Peter, go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Jim. So we saw like about a 30% jump up. The other two things we saw that were fascinating, the traffic patterns, is there was prime time seemed to flatten out. There wasn't an evening where people started streaming. It was just all day because we may not be an essential worker, but for me to do my job, not having Disney Plus or Netflix, my children would just be running around tearing the wallpaper off the walls or something. So we've seen that kind of flattening of prime time. We've also seen the weekends disappear. It used to be where traffic patterns would kind of very cyclically go up and down during the week, and then at the weekends it would kind of ebb away as people went to social events, to things, actually leave the house. Now people are just sat in the house doing the same thing they do during the week. It's the weekends have gone and prime time has flattened out. So one really cool anecdote, which we brought up in one of our meetings, was we were looking at the traffic patterns in Spain particularly, and every evening there was this weird drop in all the traffic, exactly 8 o'clock every night, day after day. And we're like, why is the traffic going away for 3 minutes? And it's because everyone was going outside, pausing, going outside and clapping for the healthcare workers. But this was such a human thing to see in just like Grafanas. We're like going, why is this spike reoccurring? Is there something, is it like we were looking for BGP router failovers, and networking people immediately go to try and solve a networking problem. But in reality, this is just a very human manifestation in what we look at traffic logs.
Well, and as a matter of fact, I remember hearing one of the network engineers recently talking about a high-speed line they had that was down that cows kept stepping on, and it was causing problems as well. Jim, what's your take in terms of the new normal?
I do think we're going to see a lot more streaming of sport events because no one can go to they can't physically go, so their only option is to watch. And I love that I'm the American but living in the UK, and the two Brits are living in the US. But football is, soccer to the US is massive here. And EPL relaunching, restarting is going to be epic. So there's going to be, substantial spikes in viewership. Now, viewership, when you measure it against physical audience, those at the stadia, and then the actual streaming audience. But what I think is actually going to happen is just a shift from watching Netflix or D plus to watching live sports. So the patterns that Peter was talking about will still, those aren't going to shift. It's just the content is going to shift.
And I'll add, what's interesting is today, because we're doing this, recently got married, and our two little girls are now, thank you, are now watching a DVD of Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry upstairs because we don't want them Netflix streaming at the moment, messing up this important part. But I'd also add the other anecdote is yesterday with the, well, 2 days ago and yesterday with the SpaceX launch, with 2.7 million people watching on YouTube. Those are events that don't necessarily always get carried on television, and yet you can have a global audience who watches those. So Jim, I agree. I think it's somewhat of an interesting shift, even if it's not sports. It's a shift to watching live, but still watching it on streaming. Okay, so the one last question that I have from our list, and then I've got a question from the audience. The one question is on CMAF. What's the potential of CMAF in terms of number of segments we have to put out, variations, and that kind of thing? And Jim, I'll start with you on that.
Well, it was very interesting hearing Nick's presentation on Fubo and what Fubo is doing, because it's sort of in line. I sort of, my experience has been that content creators, content providers are not leveraging the fact that you can do both with one to a large degree, one format to rule them all. But there are serious limitations. For example, not everyone does the same segment length. So you'll have a short segment length for Dash, but you'll have a 6-second segment length for HLS. And not everyone can deliver, HLS via fragmented MP4. So I'm hopeful that as things like Apple low latency HLS and, as things are moving more towards fragmented MP4, that publishers will start being able to create single formats, or, work with a single format. The other aspect that puts a wrinkle in this is DRM. And I realized after you switched to Neil about edge compute that I didn't actually talk about edge compute at all. But he hit basically most of what I was going to talk about. But I do think, for example, that one of the benefits of edge compute would be the ability to encode for a multi-DRM at the edge so that it doesn't matter which flavor of DRM a customer requires. Now, I think there's some pretty serious compute required there, and I don't know what's doable, but at least we can start thinking about it, and we can start envisioning a world where, yes, it's a video chunk, and this video chunk could be HLS, it could be Dash, it could be smooth streaming. It just can't be HDS. Actually, I think anyway.
I'm going to bite my tongue on that because I wrote the HDS smooth streaming document to help go toward Dash. But you bring up an interesting point, which is we had encoding, which was not in real time. Then it became in real time. We had packaging that was not in real time. Then it became real time. Now we have DRM that typically isn't in real time, but could potentially move toward that based on these permutations or renditions or recipes that we put together. Peter, Neil, quickly, CMAF before we go on to Q&A.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in there, Tim. So what's promising about CMAP is we started that journey maybe 4 or 5 years ago when Microsoft and Apple announced that they were going to collaborate on something, which was kind of like, you know, people were checking Leviticus at this point, you know, something about lions and lambs and stuff, you know. What's happened so far, and I've done this survey probably every 3 months, and I'd love to like look at Nick's and probably collaborate on something, is I've looked across the device ecosystem to see how close are we to when we could have one format. Because obviously as a CDN, having one format means there's only one object in cache, which means we can store more objects, which means they deliver more efficiently. And there's lots of good things for us, lots of good things for publishers too. A lot less storage, much more efficient, better start times, all this good. There's lots of goodness. So we should aim for that, no matter how many people come along and try to put a variant in our way. So CMAF, in my opinion, we're there. I think it's like, this last survey I did, it's like 97% of devices people care about. So these are, you know, not some old Android tablet that's stuck in a drawer somewhere that doesn't support anything anymore. CMAP is pretty much there apart from really old iPads, which people seem to hold on to those old iPads for a long time. So about 20% of active users out there still have an old iPad that cannot support fragmented MPEG-4 in a HLS manifest. There are, so CMAP's almost there. There really isn't a lot left. All browsers, all mobiles, they're all fine, unless you've got a really old iPad. There's a few older Apple TVs, which if they were given away as started promo, so we had one OTT provider that gave them away. And so they've got a whole huge seed of like older Apple TVs out there, which they can't then address. But if you look at what the big guys who launched this year, so Disney Plus just the end of last year, now into Europe, HBO Max just as of yesterday, and Peacock, all of them went CMAF only. The board. They said, you know, now's the time, new platform, let's go with CMAF. The thing they couldn't get away from was DRM. So, and it's not that, you know, you have to wrap it 3 different ways, but fundamentally you have to encrypt it 2 different ways. It's the initialization vector for the cipher. So what we've seen is the big guys are launching with CMAF only, but they're also launching both counter and CBS variants with a plan that when that number of, we're probably at 87% of devices you care about, but there's probably 13% of people that they really still care about those subscriptions, that once you get past a point where they think it's critical mass, they can just simply delete that, the legacy. So make the move to the new format, because the bulk of your audience will have all those benefits. It'll be cache efficient, you'll get better start times. The legacy devices, which are older anyway, may have a slightly, you know, not as optimal experience, but you're still serving them something that works.
And to a certain extent, as a content provider, what you may say to those people is, yes, you can experience it on here, but you may not have the optimal experience. And kind of like, I took an old gaming system and put it up for sale on Facebook Marketplace, but I made sure I went to one of the sites to see how many of the 250 games it could actually play before.
Yeah. I still have my Roku One sat on my desk here with the one that had the little tags on. Love this box, but it does, when you turn it on, it says, your box is very old. Would you like to buy a newer one? They're very reasonably priced and available at Target near you.
I've got an even older one sitting under a pile over here somewhere. Neil,
Yeah.
got one question from the audience.
Yeah, quick comment on that, just to build on Peter and Jim. But yeah, we're really excited about CMAF, especially the low latency elements, so chunk transfer encoding. It's interesting that it's sort of a tale of 2 companies at the moment, really companies that have been focusing exclusively on live events, have had time to think about advancing their technology from a low latency perspective. So certainly customers looking at dash low latency, CMAP low latency. Other companies that have got a mix of live and linear and VOD content have just been too busy to worry about anything else. Right? They're just keeping all hands to the pump. But yeah, we've done some proof of concepts, some early customer proof of concepts. So really excited about what the future might hold from a chunk transfer encoding perspective, and ready to embrace that as at whatever pace that happens.
Nice. All right, so one quick question from the audience, and this one's to you, Jim. I work in my day job as a not-for-profit with NGOs in emerging markets, and somebody's asking a question about Fastly's expansion into Africa. I know Peter or Neil mentioned India and how there's capacity there, but what about the African continent?
Specifically from a Fastly perspective?
The question was specifically to Fastly, yeah.
Yeah. So Fastly currently has several POPs in South Africa, and that's it. On the roadmap for 2020 was another POP in Northwest Africa. However, COVID-19 basically put the kibosh on that. And we are waiting until COVID-19 is over before we can continue with that.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Dom, before I go digging for my old devices, although I did find a Chromecast, maybe I could use as a giveaway. You said you had a question as well, Dom, and then I think you can.
We're hard up against time actually, and I don't want to eat into the next presentation, so I will pop my question into the chat room myself. But since we're getting out old gadgets, you found your Peter found his old Roku, you found your old Chromecast. How about this for an old vector screen?
We have X, Y coordinates, but no Z on that one. So anyway, I'd like to thank the panelists. Jim, thank you for being on. Neil, thank you for being on. Peter, as always, thank you for being on. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Tom.